Sure, because I'll start in maybe just in this area and think we have had very different stories coming together, but I think also overlapping. Just at the end, we have seen with the digitalization, very different stories coming out, and also seeing how when we talk about having a story on digitalization here in Europe, it tends to be very one-sided. So from the black holes to the new, where we sometimes think now we have information everywhere. I thought also very interesting your example with television, where we think we can organize ourselves kind of by looking from BBC to CNN to Al Jazeera. And indeed, if you do watch, you see the different stories, but you also see different content. So maybe I can just kind of start at the end by asking you to comment on the way we do have information and narratives, which I think are very different. I think, if just for one example, if I watch German television in the sort of main news, I mean there are obviously other programs as well, then I see complete different stories than if I look at BBC World. So I do then, so maybe a different kind of a story of the histories and the connectivity to past histories of colonialism, of patterns of where you do look. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. I mean, I'm not talking about what is actually said, but just making certain stories and parts of the world visible, which has these overlap of technical, bisu historical, bisu, so maybe you'd like to, would you like to comment on that, JP?
Sure.
Start with you.
All right. Well, the story I was telling you was the story of how we've narrated the global south from the north. And what I ended was the story of the World Bank, but because I was finishing up fast, it was my attempt to understand a story from below. And my impetus was what you just mentioned, Cristina, about experts not understanding the world. Mm-hmm. And so what I did in order to try to understand what would make, or what makes a difference in people's lives, was to go ask people about their lives, or try to do an anthropology, or a very different approach to understanding lives. You only saw the quantitative results from that. They were based on ethnographic research that I carried out in Kenya and in India, mostly in the slums in Nairobi, in Kibera and Mathare, and Dharavi in Mumbai, the slum, and Alavi north of Chennai, because I wanted to understand how people understood information technologies in their lives. What did they see was the potential, so what we understand as participation. And part of that motivation was that when I, in passing, mentioned my colleagues don't like the World Bank, because I think that's where the death of expertise lies. Either we are too far on the left, in which case the world has just known the ravages of capitalism, and we can sit guilty in the global north and say capitalism is all bad, World Bank is part of that institution, or we are on the right and say why care about those people at all? What have they done for us? Either way, it's a roadblock. Because what I was hearing from the slums was, what is M-Pesa going to do for my life? What is Airtel going to do for my life? How is Vodafone going to help me find seeds? How am I going to get this microfinance loan? Why is Vodafone charging me a 25% interest rate even though I like M-Pesa? Those are everyday lives, and those are the stories we need to hear to get beyond these ideological barriers, which is where I think the death of expertise is. The main discourse about the global south, and I'm going to be provocative here, the main discourse about the global south in academia is way off on the left and does not connect with problems of economic incentives, of livelihoods. How am I going to send my children to school? If everything is neoliberal globalization gone all bad, it does not resonate with somebody's life. Even if it's gone all bad, it does not translate over. And so to find a new narrative would mean, to me, and I know this, I'm kind of praising my own research, would mean for us to get out of our comfort zones and go to, I so admired what you were able to do with human trafficking networks, and I was like, how did you find access to do that? Because it's, part of our barrier is not just resources, it's about just being able to go and listen and to be able to find out those
Mirjam, can I just ask you to comment?
Yeah, I think, thanks again for this discussion. I think what I see is that, what Cristina was mentioning was very important, that globalization leads to fragmentation. And I think we have all in different ways been speaking to that. So then the question is, how does that lead to a sense of responsibility? And I think that, I was really enlightened with the approach that in last night's lecture by Timothy Snyder, he approached that, because what he clarified, at least to me, is that we have these two different ways of thinking about the future. The one which is like, if we do more development cooperation, we do more economics, we do more digital. That is my colleagues at computer science. They think more innovation. Innovation is good. We all get better. That is the future of a kind of a positive line that will just keep on going into that direction. And then the alternative that he had was the future of nothingness, of collective hopelessness, of going backwards, of fragmentation. I think that the way I see it is that we have to recognize that even if we have created a very interconnected world with very globalizing elements of it, like ICT, like digital. What happens with that in a place is always different. So that fragmentation is as real as the globalization is. Then where does the care come from? For me, that is in that we have to learn to bridge. Not to collaborate to get others to develop in the way we have already developed, which you were saying hasn't worked and will not work. But we have to realize that people are in different situations than ourselves, and that we have an interest and a common interest to understand that and to see how we can talk to each other. And then from there, other things can develop. And that is my thought in terms of how we have to go forward with this reality that we suddenly find ourselves in.
Sorry, we only have two, so I'll just take this back for a second. Yes, maybe I can take it up from there and ask you, Craig, if we look at the construction of firms, and certainly if we distinguish between the large scale, the international, the globalized, where of course it's much easier to sort of say, also taking up, oh well, this is the bad capitalism. So you can kind of say, well, we can't change it. These firms are almighty powerful. The globalization processes are non-transparent. They are so connected in different stories, there's not much to do. So if I jump from there and say, right, okay, well, let's have a look at the small and medium-sized firms, the kind of firm which I think this morning Wolfgang Grenke was more, we are very much in the state of Baden-Württemberg, we have very much small and middle-sized firms, and of course with the Ehrenbare, the noble, what do you call it, noble Kaufmann, businessman, as was his kind of story this morning. Do you find there is a difference? Can we make that kind of a difference when we look and see what is actually happening in the black holes? We do hear that there is more startups and young firms, which we don't hear about much here. Is that some kind of a story that we should have more in, also in the media? Is there something we can take up from there?
So let me just, if I may, just comment on this issue of the narratives and the idea of a global narrative versus a local narrative, and then transition to the point about smaller companies. So I was struck by your observation that people, Cristina, about the local narrative and people caring about the local, and struck by the thought that actually, well, what's so surprising about that, right? So why should we care about a global narrative? And as you can tell, I'm coming from that country that has chosen, seemingly, to leave the EU. A catastrophic decision, if it goes through, of just monumental proportions, right? So you know where I stand on that. I'm still hoping it won't happen. The common sense will come back and all will be good again. But let me tell you that that's not necessarily how everybody in the UK thinks. So I'm somebody that's lived outside the UK as much as I've lived within the UK, and I think of myself as European. That's part of my identity. But many people in England, not in London, not in the big metropolitan areas, but many people in the rural areas, the places outside of those big metropolises, think of themselves not in that way. It's not something that occurs to them. They think of themselves in their local context. And so when we say there should be we should be attending to a global narrative, why? And I think, well, one reason, I guess, is that we have global problems like climate change, right? And we also now have the connectivity to address topics on a global level, but of course we've heard about how that can be grossly misused in the context of Mirjam's talk. But that would be my thought around this global versus local narrative. You know, why should people care about a global narrative? When we start thinking about the roles of business in this, I'm a little bit more optimistic, Caroline, about the potential for big business doing good. Not least because big business is often subject to stakeholder pressures that require that. But when you come to small firms, I think there's also a lot of possibility there as well. And I've written a little bit about small firms and why they might do CSR and why they might do it better. One reason, very simply, is those small firms are often very closely connected to their founders, or at least to a family interest. And so those people who have a stake in the business in a very real way are often looking longer term and thinking about, well, what's the legacy going to be of this business? Another advantage I think that smaller firms have is that they have the scope to be more authentic because people are closer connected to each other within the firm. So I'm not so pessimistic about large business, but I do think there are some things that smaller companies can do and do better when it comes to being responsible.
Sorry. Can I just ask, because is it, with this kind of, what you were saying, JP, very much sort of the left and the right kind of divisions, which also tends to be sort of divided along the lines of big business and small business. So is it in some ways a kind of an argument that kind of takes us as customers or us as voters or us as stakeholders in any kind of a way out of the argument of care We say, oh, well, that's big business, so we don't really differentiate very much. It's very easy to sort of say it's not our responsibility now because it's too big, it's too globalized. Is that perhaps something that sort of, I'm trying to sort of get to the point that I think we have a connected kind of story to that we find in any case that some issues, be it with refugees or with climate change, tend to be a story for a certain time, and then we don't hear much about the story anymore, although the problem has not gone away, it's very often even got worse. So is this kind of a mechanism that we think we are overloaded, to take up on our theme here, and so we tend just not to look at things anymore. And also they don't get reported because it's not a story anymore. What kind of connection do we have here with respect to the responsibility of having to have information so that you can have empathy to think about care or to think about what to change? But if stories aren't visible, then we tend not to look anymore. Would you like to comment?
Well, I usually I normally use I try to remember the pedagogical responsibility of the media, because even if the stories are as visible as we want to make them visible, and. Going back to your initial point about the role of BBC and so on, it's true. I think for me right now, BBC World is the most universal outlet. Probably because first it comes from a country where had that mindset of, I don't like to say empire, but that universal context. I mean, the Commonwealth itself, it's an example. But second, because many other outlets have not the resources anymore. And that has become an economic problem. And big media corporations are corporations. And they have, as I said, they are also suffering an economic crisis. So we always say that foreign correspondence is a profession in extinction, because there are no resources. There are no resources to maintain foreign correspondence. And the role they have and the way they exert their work is very fragile in many places. So that may be a reason. However, we have other ways to tell those stories, and that's where social media and citizens' journalism comes in, done in a responsible way. Just let me, Craig, you're totally right. When I point to global narratives, I only tackle those issues which are global in nature and that affects us as individuals wherever we are, as climate change, of course, as migrations, as also capitalism regulation. Because talking about corporations, what happens with the big platforms, what is happening with Facebook, for instance, the capacity of Facebook to interfere with not only politics, but our lives, to tell us what we want to read, what we want to watch, who we want to be in touch with, that's a problem. And, I think that's a global problem, because even if the Chinese don't use it, but most of the rest of the world does. So that's where I think we have to have a common conversation. Of course, every person, every organization will have their own ideas about it, but at least I think we have to have a common conversation, and that's being challenged.
I'd like to ask one more question before we go to the public, especially with the question of what's happening with trafficking. Trafficking, and also, I think when we had the situation which we've talked about a lot here, in 2015, with the migrants coming, we had this kind of dilemma that many who were helpers, wanted to be helpers, were, in my view, often very irresponsible, because they sometimes used the digital media, the phones, to contact those who were still on the other side of the Mediterranean, and to show them pictures of how wonderful society is here, and having this kind of a pull, and taking people from Nigeria or coming all the way up through Africa at great risk of the being trafficked on the way, and then, of course, also crossing the Mediterranean. What can we do to also have a responsibility about the kind of stories and the kind of pictures which we are sending to young worlds which are very much younger than old Europe and which are giving the wrong kind of a signal? What kind of responsibility do we have in that kind of question? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, thank you.
What kind of effect is that having?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, and I think many in the audience probably also recognize that dilemma. What I see is that what is being communicated is very complex, and there's a lot of nuance in that. So you have the pictures of the grass is greener on the other side, what you are referring to. But one thing that has concerned us also very much is that the pictures of, for instance, after the boat sank in Lampedusa, of all these 360 coffins. Well, I've shown you some of the pictures that I think some people found really shocking, but they are sent to, all relatives of people in those situations would have seen them and so on. So what we have researched over the last years is what is the effect of these traumatizing, deeply traumatizing pictures on the decisions that people take. And our expectation in a way is that if we show how bad it is and how difficult and dangerous it is to come, then that will stop people from taking those dangerous journeys. But that's not what we have seen people do. And so why is that? And I don't think that I should occupy the space here now to go in the kind of the range of things that may happen, because these are nuanced stories. But one thing that is worthwhile pointing out is that people who have already come from very traumatizing histories, I've shown some of the torture-related things that have happened, in which they are also directly in contact often with brothers, sisters, younger siblings who experience that and for which you are responsible, which gives you also, connects you to that trauma, gives you secondary trauma. What we know, Kahneman has written very beautifully about that. When our mind is in a very traumatized space, it's very difficult for us to take rational decisions. So we keep fleeing. And that is what we see people do. And so what concerns me even more than the pictures of the grass is greener than it is in reality, as we know, what concerns me more is the pictures that are very traumatizing and deepen the trauma that people are in. And then I think that the presentation that you gave, GP, is very important. Because if we come back with a global narrative that things here are the way in which they should be, and all the information and the knowledge that you need to be economically effective, then that is where you're gonna go, especially when you're already in a panic. So unless we somehow change that into a story in which we can recognize the value of every space, different from our own space, that's why I say we need to bridge. Unless we value those spaces, people are going to come here because we are telling them that that is the best place to be. And actually the pictures show pretty much that that is where the economic opportunities are. So who can blame them? So we need to start giving value to places that are different. and see the value that those places have in terms of real values, rights values, but also of economic opportunity. And so that is, I think, that is our obligation. And that can be a global process, but it needs to give value to the context in which people live and recognize that those contexts are always going to be different, and that is good.
I think I can't help but agree that we need to tell a more complex story. Then I would turn to people like Cristina, Manzano to say, how do you tell a complex story? And then this is the input I would have, and then you can say, well, I would just completely reject that. And one of the inputs I would have is that most of the trafficking and the migration is not south to north, it's south to south. Right. And it's not going to help anyone in the West to know that most people are going from Tanzania to Kenya or Uganda to Kenya, because who cares? Right. They're boarding ships and coming across the Mediterranean, and they're eating into our social security and healthcare systems and education systems, and they don't behave like upright citizens. We're all traumatized by that. I really like the word trauma because both the recipients and the migrants who are coming are both traumatized. We don't like to see one of them do anything that's bad because they should have been grateful that they were here. And that's trauma speaking. Because if we weren't traumatized, we would know that a person who just came on a ship under the most inhumane conditions possible cannot possibly be expected to be the best citizen in Germany as soon as she arrives on this land. It's our lack of being in touch with our emotions completely that we don't see that human in front of us as a human, we just see a criminal. And so that criminalization can only stop if we found the humanity within us and we opened ourselves to more of a complex narrative. By that very same token, I would also, I was searching in my mind for, since I don't know the human trafficking problem north to south, but I know it within south. And the case that I know the best is the one I grew up with in India, that of basically indentured servants, probably about 200 million women and children who work as domestic servants in India under really inhumane conditions from 6 in the morning till 10 in the evening, or even later, for very little. And it's not that the complex narrative is not there. It's tied in to the way cultural stratifications are maintained in society. And it's very hard, even within one's family, to turn around to a mother, a sister, a brother, or even to myself and say, that's really exploitative. And I'm going to go on a leap here very quickly to say that that's where I hesitate in thinking that small units are any better than big units. And that applies to corporations. Because the Gemeinschaft of, if I can use that term, I realize I'm in Germany, I shouldn't use that term. The Gemeinschaft of small units is precisely that they come with cultural hierarchies, and they operate in a way in which they might maintain caste, class, gendered, sexual oppressions, and so if I was to choose between a corporation in India versus a small business down the street to say, what would be the most liberating experience for me as a human being? And I'm not saying just me, I'm just talking about a young college graduate. It wouldn't be the way it's seen in the West, and that's another complex story to tell. Yes, one understands that the Facebooks and the Amazons and all have the power they do. For example, in Kenya, when I worked in the slums, very few people were aware when they were getting their microfinance loans that to that little small business that ran the microfinance loan, they had access to their Facebook. They'd signed away that, and they were using sociometrics to credit score people's lives, basically what they were saying to their friends, what they were reading, what they were sharing, then amounted to a credit score. So yes, that's the sort of power that needs to be exposed, but on the other hand, they would rather turn to that microfinance authority than their relative for loans because the latter comes with way too many strings attached. So maybe you're being between a rock and a hard place, but I think that's what I mean by getting beyond our ideological jails where we begin to see this beauty of smallness, whereas the beauty of smallness also carries huge human rights violations and oppressions. And the beauty of bigness doesn't mean that it doesn't carry it, but I think putting on the hat right might mean, or cap right, or whatever, turban right, is to go beyond these grand ideological narratives and trying to see what kind of stories need to be written or narratives that might go beyond.
May I give an example that really links to what you just said? And because again, my work is on narrative and how we tell stories. Maybe have you watched or are aware about this new film, Roma?
Yes.
Do you know it?
We hope to win.
We hope it wins too. To me, it gives two wonderful examples. One, it's a story coming from the south. It's not exactly the south. It's the south of the north. But anyway, it's coming from Mexico. It's not the typical American or British, story. And I think that the Anglo-Saxon perspective filters everything in this global conversation. And I think that has to stop, because if we want it to be global, it has to be global, really. But the other thing is how it has given voice and image to maids all over the world, and to the silent work of thousands, millions of women and men too, who do domestic work, and we never talked about them. And that is wonderful. It is a movie. I mean, nothing else and nothing less. And how that can change and start a new conversation.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so I'll make it short. I'd just like to link the social media conversation and the trafficking, because Mirjam and I had this conversation during the break, and she was explaining which apps were being used by these essentially kidnappers in the human trafficking chain, and they're using WhatsApp, they're using email, they're using Facebook, and I think that raises a bigger question. And if I may say so, Cristina, I thought you held back a little bit in talking about the social media, because I think they have a responsibility. When we talk about firms having responsibility, the social media are going out of their way to avoid having responsibility, and other digital platforms as well. If you think about not just social media, not just the Facebooks, but the Ubers, the Airbnb, they're replacing traditional businesses, but not taking on the mantle of responsibility that those businesses had. And I think there's a real a gap there that needs to be filled.
Yes, thank you very much for that comment. Now we shall take very few quick questions.
So they may be both, right? So there are, I think, serious questions to be asked about Snowden and about WikiLeaks. Some people would say Snowden, for example, the US would say he compromised the security, the national security. But equally, you could say, well, he exposed illegal activity by the US government. So I think they can be both, and I think it calls for a measure of responsibility by somebody that chooses to be a whistleblower. But let me also say, that's not an easy path to take. So if you look at the stories of whistleblowers, they're often quite sad stories, because these people become persona non grata in the industries in which they were originally found. So it's interesting. I have a German colleague who's been trying to do research around what people at the company have disclosed, both prior to and subsequent to the issue blowing up. And there's very little out there. So I'm sort of puzzled, and I don't, frankly, I'm I guess somewhat ignorant about it. I'm puzzled why there weren't whistleblowers. And the evidence today seems to suggest that there weren't. I mean, there's something about the culture of VW, there's something about it being a very inward-looking organization, a very authoritarian, hierarchical organization that maybe was stifling in a lot of ways. But I haven't seen evidence of somebody trying to whistleblow, and I'm surprised, but maybe I just haven't come across it.
Okay, can we go on to the next person here who is going to ask a question?
It's a complex issue. But anyway, I think, I don't know how to say that in English. In Spanish it's very simple because we have two different words for simplicity, and they mean different things. We have to try to make things easier to understand without taking the complexity out of them. Because what we are seeing is that populists use very simple messages. They simplify the reality, a very complex reality, to give a very, very, very powerful message, and that works. But yes, you're right, the language is very, very important. And I think that, for instance, in terms of narratives, in terms of reaching out to the people, and I think Germany is a different case for that, because your language is already very difficult and very complex. I mean, not difficult, sorry. No, very complex. It includes a lot of nuances for many, many things. But for instance, in terms of climate change, I think we were losing the battle because of the language, because the narrative was kidnapped by technical people. And we have been only talking about tons of emissions, different degrees in temperature, very, very technical things. When I follow climate change very closely, when I listen to a real expert, I get bored. I tell you, I get bored, because it tells me nothing. At the end, it becomes something very technical. And that is what we need to change. We have to tell people why this is important for us, for everyone, and also what we can do. It has to be part of our daily lives. But language is essential, yeah.
I think, just to complicate things even more, one thing that you said was very important. We find that language gets kidnapped, especially terms. They change over time, and then suddenly a term which we thought was, I put it in commas, progressive or forward-looking, suddenly gets put into a completely different context. So it becomes really difficult, and that's even just within one language. Then we take the cultural point, JP, and we're in a completely different kind of dimension where, again, terms and languages become very different, because obviously the contexts are different. The historical experience is different, and different groups have put in context into a certain term in a different way. So I think language is we could have a whole Karlsruhe dialogue only on the question of language. Okay, but we're not going to do that today.
Well, just to reiterate what I was saying a moment ago, I think we should be looking to the likes of Facebook to be more responsible, maybe not to the same degree as the organizations they're replacing, but we should be looking to them to assume a greater degree of responsibility. And that should be coupled as well with legal sanctions. So there should be sanctions against the organizations, regulations that govern what they do to a far greater extent than we have today. I think there's another side of the story, and I won't go on too long, and that's what's our responsibility as consumers in using these platforms. Should we be using them? Should we be demanding more of these companies?
Thank you for very good questions. The question you asked is, what are we going to do? What is the solution with these black holes, and how are we going to find them? My answer to that is that what the black holes show is that technology and information technology is a social process. And therefore, it's different how it appears, and it is something that in which people as human beings are present. And I think that is really the crucial recognition. And are the black holes only in the way I told the story? I mean, my mom was still very healthy, but really aging. I mean, I don't want to call my mom a black hole, but she has a lot of difficulties in trying to connect to all the things that are asked of her. And so really it is for us to bring back people as human and social people, and then we find solutions, and we can connect, we can talk, we can always talk. So to me, that is the crux of the solution.
Thank you very much. Just go down.
I would use exactly the same answer because there are many ways and many other outlets. There are gatherings of global people, there are gatherings of local people, and there are many outlets that we don't know that may exist yet. That's the exciting thing about our current situation. We didn't know Facebook 15 years ago. We couldn't imagine that could work. We didn't know Twitter until 10 years ago. And we don't know what kind of thing will be invented that will facilitate our communication. But I totally agree with you. It's for me, the most important thing is to begin from the very beginning, which is we talk. And from then on. And again, going back to what just Craig said, our own responsibility as individuals. If I may quote very quickly, there is a survey done by a company every year on trust. And this year, what they said, it was only for American citizens, but what they said is that because of all these effects of Facebook and misinformation and Russia and so on, people are starting not to trust the media, but they are starting to contrast information, where they get their information from. And I think that is very positive. I don't have to just trust what you tell me, I go to different places, and that goes back to our own role. So yeah.
So very quickly, until we had the news story in our horizon about how we want everything simplified and into soundbites, most research was showing that we're increasingly skillful individuals, and we shouldn't forget that we're able to contrast different types of worldviews, and so both of those coexist, and it's very important to remember that that same child who's addicted to the internet for 6 hours can also be very skillful in negotiating different kinds of, just as a refugee might be able to say, I'm going to face all kinds of hardships in Europe if I migrate there, but here's what living in a prosperous country might be all about. Why do we need the World Bank? For the following reasons. Donald Trump gave more funding to the World Bank last year, even though they were going to cut off official development assistance there, because to counter China. 2, because China and the Asian Development Bank and other places still doesn't have the kind of knowledge bank that the World Bank represents. 3, it represents a hope about a global institutionalism that might be able to create, in some ways, very hegemonic, very ideologically driven narratives, but on the other hand, narratives that resonate and people resist. You don't find people on the streets protesting against UNESCO policies. You find people on the streets protesting against World Bank policies because it speaks to their lives. And that's why I think we need the World Bank. And that's why the presidency of the World Bank, which is being decided right now, is so contentious. Yeah. And ask people who is the Director General of UNESCO, and they wouldn't know. On the other hand, I would say the following. Once, and I'll end with that, I presented a very critical paper about UNESCO, and my colleague who was the discussant, the respondent to that, comes from sort of the realist, liberal institutionalist tradition. I could only think that she would actually agree with me. And she said at the end to me, she said, you know what, you're wrong, we need UNESCO. And I think we need UNESCO or World Bank because it reminds us of who we are, how far we've come in these efforts. And that's where I would go all out to preserve both bodies.
Well, of course, I very quickly have to also say, although I'm very critical of UNESCO, we need UNESCO because I'm in the Cultural Council of the German UNESCO, and this afternoon we shall also have the head of the Cultural Council of UNESCO in our conversation.